Thank you, Bill. Being here this morning really is a homecoming for me. 48 years ago, at the age of 24, I first stood on this chancel and began my life in preaching and ministry. In that long journey, one of the many things that my friends and family had to put up with was often hearing me introduced, not with all the books, Robin, but with a phrase that was given to me along with an honorary degree by Starr King. They called me the evangelical rabbi of liberal religion. A phrase that I subsequently discovered was coined by my one-time colleague, Forrest Church. But it provoked my daughter to send me a card she found at college that had a drawing on it of a rabbinic figure about my, a lot of resemblances. The glasses, the beard, a rather well-traveled robe and a prayer shawl, and somehow the hair all loved off on top under a little yarmulke, with the label, the Velveteen Rabbi. With the question, when do I get to go out and run and play with the real rabbis? Well, when I got a call from your one-time minister of religious education, that wonderful Rabbi Carol Haig, asking me to come to New Jersey in May and deliver a paper on Universalist history at Murray Grove, I of course said yes. And then a few weeks later, when I thought I remembered the date quite clearly as this weekend, I called Robin and asked if I could possibly come to Summit to preach. She said yes. Now, if you look at the announcements in your order of worship, you'll see that you can come hear me at Murray Grove 2 weeks from now. Because on Friday night, I arrived there. No history convocation. Somehow in the midst of writing another history, the date had floated down that river that begins with L. I was greeted instead by the men's group of the Montclair Unitarian Church that was at Murray Grove on retreat, and they were very understanding. They said they found it comforting that even the former president of the association could make a fool of himself. And I will be back in 2 weeks. When the candles were being lit, the stream of consciousness that is the soul was bringing back into memory the people that I first knew here so many years ago. Dean Starr, whom I assisted in ministry that year. Jake Trapp, who had been here before him. Jake often said that we knew one another before we ever physically met. He wasn't just being mystical, although he could be that. He meant that people here had been writing him about me, and that I had gotten to know him through the congregation that he had helped to shape. And I have never lost gratitude for the way in which people had been shaped to be in dialogue between pulpit and pew. You see, Jake, among other things, was one of the first Gentile scholars to really treasure the work of the great Jewish sage Martin Buber, who knew that at the heart of religion there is that I-thou relationship that somehow brings the eternal into the relational and into the present. So when I would venture to say something from this chancel in my 24-year-old wisdom, it would amaze me that I never received fewer than about a dozen written letters in response. You know, people used to write letters, and not just emails. Brilliant, insightful letters. Grateful ones. Helpful ones. encouraging ones. Alice Berry, Fred McGill, Jimmy, Sally Nelson. Oh my God, the names go on. How great a cloud of witnesses surround us in our lives, but especially in sacred places like this. Those who have gone before. Jake had a meditation taken from the great novel Dr. Zhivago by Boris Pasternak, in which the doctor becomes almost a priest to a young woman he's treating for cancer and cannot save. He says to her, "Your soul will live on, you know. Your soul is others in you, and then you in others." That is the nature of our consciousness, which, though it may flee from us entirely, and will somehow live on in others whose lives we have shaped, where the light, the wisdom, the learning has been passed on. I thanked Margaret a few minutes ago for the best piece of parenting advice I ever received as a minister when I was raising my daughters in Manhattan. And they were treating me as what I call Daddy ATM. Ever have that experience with a teenager? And Margaret recommended that I do what she had done with her sons, put them on a big fat allowance where they have to buy even their clothes and all their entertainment. Boy, it worked. It helped make my daughters more self-reliant, and I couldn't be more proud of what they are doing as teachers and leaders in healthcare. Well, when I first came here, I knew relatively little from my own experience, but I knew that I was expected to also mediate some of the wisdom of those who had gone before in the great tradition. And so I specialized in doing things like teaching the Bible for skeptics, seekers, and religious liberals, going back to the classics, which are constantly there, full of story and richness for us to unpeel and re-understand. Our forebears sometimes in this faith thought that they were getting too much history, too much Bible. I think of Emerson complaining at the beginning of his great book, Nature, his first book. Our age is retrospective. It builds the sepulchres of the fathers, it writes biographies, histories, and criticism. But the foregoing generations beheld God and nature face to face. We, only through their eyes? Why should not we also enjoy an original relation to the universe? Why should we not have a poetry and philosophy of insight and not of tradition? And a religion by revelation to us and not merely the history of theirs? Well, friends, the older I get, the more history I write. The more that history is biography. Because as it says at the beginning of my last book, before everything else, religion is people. It may develop institutions, it may develop leaders, it may develop a sense of mission, particular to its time and place. But first of all, it is people. So why can we not have both? Both memory and a religion that is lived right here in the present, as already you have been invited to do in meditation and in encounter, so that the heart of the relationship, there is something of the eternal that will be transformative enough so that we will carry it with us into the world that so much needs a sense of stability and deeper values and deeper connection in a time that suffers from amnesia, self-involvement, selfishness, and callousness. Here we are to be transformed into the people we're meant to be. We're to remember our souls. Too often we take for granted the advantages we have over those who were lived in the past. I think of Emerson again. One of the most poignant scenes in his life. Young Louisa May Alcott lived across the street, down the road. She came to see one morning if young Waldo, who was her age, could come out and play. And Mr. Emerson stood in the doorway and said, "Child, he is dead. He died during the night of scarlet fever." How often we don't stop to give thanks for the way that, for the most part, we've quelled infectious disease when we're wise enough to vaccinate. We don't give thanks over our plumbing in the house that even Mr. Emerson did not have. We take too much for granted that makes our lives comfortable, when in fact, if we are shaping our soul, we are, well, one of the things I learned in this pulpit is that the work of preaching is to comfort the afflicted, but also afflict the comfortable, to prompt the conscience, to include the other. So my purpose today isn't entirely to wax nostalgic. After all, as one wit said, nostalgia is not what it used to be. To which another replied, no, and it never was. It's more to reflect on the nature of memory, its use, and yes, its loss, for transformation. Jake used to say that he never would have survived in ministry without the poets, and so I think of T.S. Eliot, whose grandfather was a Unitarian minister and who wrote memorably, "These are the uses of memory: for liberation, not less of love, but expanding of love beyond desire, and so liberation from the future as well as the past." Liberation from the future. I remember the senior minister who spoke at my ordination to the ministry, telling the congregation I was then serving that they were not to tether me to their past, but also not stake me out to an idealized future, but simply to be with me in the present, which needed us to be as present to one another and to the wisdom of our experience and of the ages as we possibly could be. Today I get to benefit from the ministry of your former minister, having had some part of helping to shape her for ministry, as I did to Robin, but this is how the light is passed from one generation to another. And as I now reach that stage of life where I must be conscious that at the end all will be lost, indeed consciousness itself, not just the things that bore memories, but the memories themselves. I have to hang on to not only the wit of my wife, who says, about the things, we've downsized a lot. Dear, I've never yet seen a hearse with a U-Haul behind it. And I've never yet been at a bedside of someone dying and losing their memories, where what I wanted and hoped I heard as last on their lips was not simply thank you. Thank you for all that has been, for all that remains, for all that I have been able to pass on through the years. I really appreciate at 72 what Collins says about forgetfulness. I rationalize my own lapses by saying that, well, it's not the retrieval mechanism that has fallen apart. It's just that after all these years, there's so many names and dates back there. But I don't want to be too flip about the loss of memory either. It can be painful to see someone lose it prematurely. I've had very dear friends diagnosed with early Alzheimer's. Feel them losing themselves and flailing. But I've also had brilliant friends, fellow Harvard grads, colleagues in ministry, a successful fundraiser who had studied family systems therapy, who leaned into the loss of memory, even the loss of identity, so that at the end, all they would say to others was, thank you, thank you, thank you. It was after the death of that child of his that Emerson wrote his most profound essay, in my estimation, the one he called Experience, in which he said that we all live life on a staircase, with one set of steps going down into the past, another going up beyond us and fading out of sight. Both directions. The wisdom in looking back, if we can, even at the painful parts where the view isn't all that easy, is that sometimes there is some deeper understanding and some forgiveness that emerges that is much needed. We need to forgive our forebears, after all, for much of their blindness about gender, class, and race, and heterodominance, and the taking for granted the temporary privilege of physical ability. I think of a poet like W.H. Auden, who gained much from going through therapy, as many of us have, who said in his memorial poem for Sigmund Freud, he wasn't clever at all. He merely told the unhappy present to recite the past, like a poetry lesson, till sooner or later it faltered at the line where long ago the accusations had begun, and suddenly knew by whom it had been judged, how rich life had been, and how silly. And was life forgiven and more humble? Certainly in that great trilogy of Micah's that calls on us to practice justice, love mercy, and walk humbly, it is the last that comes hardest and often latest in life. In my most recent decade, I've begun a spiritual discipline I should have begun years and years ago, called living by heart. You notice Collins talked about some poems that he had learned by heart. Well, they slip away too. But I now begin my morning meditations, not only centered in my chair and centered in my experience, but also centered in waiting for the poets to come, including those whose verses have become enshrined as scripture, reminding me, well, I remember my mother, who died at 89 after a decade in a wheelchair with multiple sclerosis. All she would say toward the end was, "My cup runneth over." From the 23rd Psalm. Yet at times, when I was here, I found that I had to commit some poems to memory that would help in counseling, especially the young, like myself. And so the first poem I learned by heart is one with which I'll end this morning. I found it very useful. at times when we are feeling too much self-pity. It's by the English poet Philip Larkin, and has to be slightly cleaned up to be used from the pulpit. It goes this way. They F you up, your mom and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They hand on all the faults they had and add some extra just for you. But remember, he could add, but they were effed up in their turn by fools in old-style hats and coats who half the time were soppy stern and half at one another's throats. Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like the coastal shelf. Get out as quickly as you can. And don't have any kids yourself. To which the critic, as well as the pastoral counselor, says, notice that he so accurately captures our self-indulgent, self-involved despair as to render it completely absurd and to liberate us both from the past and from the future in order that we might be transformed right here in the present and focus on that which we can and must pass on to others. The best that is within us. The abiding gratitude. The deep soulfulness of being truly human with one another. This is why we are here. This is what this place is for. It is a spiritual home to teach us how to go on our homebound journey. Oh, and why did I clean it up? Well, that's because Dean Starr, who preached at my ordination, threatened in the ordination sermon to lift up the fact that I'd often cussed at the office here. And to say publicly, oh, and John, don't use the F word from the pulpit. No, Dean. The only word that I will use here or at the very end is thank you. Thank you for letting me be real, letting me grow, letting me pass on some of what was in you that is now in me, that goes on beyond us to the end of time.